Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you all so much for joining us, and from all over the world, I think, today, and particularly in absolutely stellar numbers. Masterpiece offers endless opportunities for visitors to look and learn about works of art by engaging with our passionate and knowledgeable exhibitors and by handling objects in a relaxed but stimulating way, something which I know we're all very much missing at present. Our talks and education program plays an important role at Masterpiece, and we will continue this learning process throughout the year, engage both an established and a new audience eager to learn and to discover new ways of looking at works of art. Encountering beauty through the material world followed on from our Masterpiece Symposium in early February. Each month, we are looking at 6 different materials. February was devoted to marble and stone, this month to wood, and will be followed by pigment, bronze, ceramic, and precious stones. This exploration spans cultures and time through a series of podcasts, videos, and panel discussions. And please do visit our website, masterpiecefair.com, to see the full extent of the programs devoted to materials. And I hope you'll also all join us again at the same time on April the 22nd for the origins of pigment. Today, the second of our monthly panel discussions will focus on wood and is entitled The Narrative Beauty of Wood. I would like to extend my deep thanks to our wonderful speakers, and especially to Dr. Megan Aldrich, who will moderate the discussion this afternoon. Megan has a very distinguished career as a scholar and lecturer, and currently edits the Journal of the Furniture History Society, having started her career in the Department of Furniture and Woodwork at the Victoria and Albert Museum. Megan, if I may, I will hand over to you to conduct this afternoon's proceedings and to introduce our wonderful speakers. Thank you.
Welcome to everyone, whether it be morning, perhaps afternoon or evening, depending upon where you're listening from. We're delighted to have so many people interested in hearing more about woods. We have a very distinguished panel of experts who work with wood in a professional capacity in various ways. We have a museum curator who will be speaking today, a restorer, an antiques dealer, and a gallerist. So we're covering a wide range of territory, and they have some beautiful images of woods to show you. So the way it will work is we'll have our 4 speakers during the first part of this session, and then afterwards, please do put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll be putting your questions to the panel. So without further ado, the first of our speakers, who's going to reflect on the significance of wood as a material in terms of artworks, is Ada Dewitt. She is curator of works of art and sculpture at the Wallace Collection. She is also a trustee of the Grinling Gibbons Society. You'll hear a little bit more about this important figure in just a moment. And her book, Grinling Gibbons and the Golden Age of Wood Carving, The Netherlands and Britain, 1650 to 1700, will be published later this year. So Ada, we turn to you.
Well, thank you so much for this introduction. And hello, everybody. Can I have the first slide, please? All right. So at the Wallace Collection, I'm responsible for objects made of various materials, mainly metal. But my association with woodwork is due to my PhD thesis, which is on 17th century wood carving in the Netherlands and Britain. And Grinling Gibbons plays an important role in my research. And for those who don't know him, Gibbons is seen as the most famous woodcarver in history. He decorated St. Paul's Cathedral, Hampton Court, Windsor Castle, and some iconic country houses such as Petworth. And he is credited with introducing realistic carving in lime wood to England. Before him, his English carving was dominated by oak. And lime wood is soft, it's easy to carve, has a fine and even texture, so you can achieve very intricate details. And there was a tradition of realistic carving in lime wood in continental Europe, but Gibbons brought it to the next level and he pushed this material to the limit. And here you can see Gibbons's Reredos at St. James's Piccadilly in London. It's a church, for those who don't know, close to Bond Street and Green Park. And this is Gibbons at his best. The carving is rich, it's three-dimensional, it's very naturalistic, and you can really identify the different types of flowers. I became interested in this subject because of research I did for a Dutch museum on a 17th century staircase that was linked to Green and Gibbons. And that staircase had absolutely nothing to do with him. But I realized that almost any good piece of 17th century carving is attributed to him, because basically people don't know any other carvers. So I was really intrigued by that. And I was also fascinated by this style of carving, which is so baroque and so over the top, full of energy and full of putti and scrolls and fruit and flowers. So I started my PhD research. And what surprised me was how little we know about wood carving. Some people thought that I'm doing research on folk art. And I also realized that curators rarely focus on wood carving because it's somewhere between sculpture and furniture. But if you think about wood carving in the 17th century, it was very important. It was really ubiquitous. And think about very different types of objects. Could I have the next slide, please? And I just show you some examples. Yes, so think about elements of interior decoration, such as staircases and overmantels, furniture and church furniture, picture and mirror frames, clocks, and there's just so many different types. And what you see here is on your left-hand side, there's a spectacular frame by Johannes Hannard, a Dutch carver from late 17th century at the Rijksmuseum. And it has a pendant, which is in New York at the Met. And on your right-hand side, that's a staircase at Sudbury Hall, carved by Edward Pierce with this lovely scrolling acanthus. But there are also other types of objects that were decorated with carvings that are, I think, a bit forgotten. And you will see some examples next slide. So on the left, on your left-hand side, you will see a carriage. It's a back of a carriage. It's Italian, early 18th century, but of course 17th century carriages were also very richly decorated. So this one is in Lisbon, in the Coach Museum. And if you have an opportunity to visit this museum, you really have to, because it's absolutely mind-blowing. And there's also, of course, ship carving, which is at the moment my favorite subject. And there's this misconception about ship carving, because I think people see naively carved 19th century figureheads in maritime museums. But in the 17th century, the best artists designed and executed ship decoration, mainly warships and states yachts. That's all gone. So I learned a lot about Gibbons and his contemporaries. He had a very big workshop and collaborated with many carvers, and they eventually adopted his style. And that, of course, makes attributions very difficult, because you have so many people working a very, very similar style. Could I please have the next slide? And here you see a detail of an overmantel at the Admiralty, Whitehall in London, and it's a pendant with navigation instruments, and they're just so accurate. They were in fact studied by maritime historians. So of course there's a question, is it Gibbons or not? The work is not documented, it does not feature his usual flowers, so it's really very difficult to say. And there are always artists who want to prove that they can carve like Gibbons, and that was already during his lifetime, but also in the 19th century, in the 20th century, and even today. And I think David Estery was a best example. He sadly passed away just 2 years ago, and he was an American wood carver who carved in Gibbons' style and became very successful in America. And Green & Gibbons still inspires, and I would urge you to Google Alexander McQueen and Green & Gibbons, and you will see some spectacular images of McQueen's designs that were inspired by Gibbons. And I think this year you will hear about him much more, because there will be the tercentenary of his death, and various events are planned. So watch the space. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very, very much, Ada, for those gorgeous images. And I know we'll be returning to them. I certainly will be during the Q&A session. The instruments are just absolutely astounding, the navigation instruments. But we now turn to speaker number 2. We're going to plow right along to allow time for discussion. And he is our restorer on the panel. His name is Tom Palmer. There he is. He's director and head of furniture and projects at Plowden and Smith. He trained at the renowned Westdean College in Sussex and has over 28 years of experience in restoring a wide range of furniture and artifacts, from early English oak to contemporary plywood. And some of his larger restoration projects have included the recent restoration of the Frank Lloyd Wright office for Edgar Kaufman, now in the V&A, the Gwynplaine Gibbons carvings on the organ case of St Paul's Cathedral in London, and the George Gilbert Scott designed interior of King's College Chapel on the Strand, again, also in London, as well as something more recent, Edoardo Palozzi's monumental London to Paris sculpture for the Cass Sculpture Foundation. So that's a wide range of work, and we welcome Tom.
Thank you very much, Megan. Good evening to everyone. I would like to talk, maybe I could have my first slide. I would like to talk about the figure of Samson I was involved in my work with Plowden and Smith. Samson is a mid-17th century carved oak figure, which formed with his partner the support for a porch outside the home of the Mayor of Norwich. The house was built in 1657, and he remained there until 1990, when his arm fell off. This exposed a large cross-section of paint layers and finely carved wood. For the safety of the figure, it was removed and stored by the Norfolk Museum Services. Samson was taken to Plowden and Smith for conservation in 2014. Following 3 centuries of exposure to the outside elements, it was clear it had lost both his feet and a section of the torso. However, at this stage, it wasn't clear how much detail remained under 60 layers of paint. Due to the high level of lead content in the paint, X-rays could not penetrate past the paint layer to give us any idea of the condition that the object remained beneath the paint. Can I have a second slide, please? During the period of storage indoors, the wood had shrunk away from the thick paint layer, leaving a gap. This slide depicts the arm, the hand. You can quite clearly see there's so much detail remaining, and it's a good layer of paint there. It's probably about 12 mil thick, the paint. So it was really fogging the detail of the carving. Following trials on localized areas, we found a method that allowed us to mechanically remove the paint without damaging the wood beneath. We eventually removed 28 kilograms of paint. The figure is actually about 6 foot tall, so that gives you some idea. There was a huge amount of paint on it. The paint was all kept. It was removed in fairly large sections because it was no longer stuck to the wood, so it was just a real shell that was around the wood. We carried out several cross-section analyses of the paint scheme. We did find traces of gilding on the surface of the wood. So we believe the belt buckle was actually gilded, and his clothes actually had gold trims. There was a fox as well that had traces of red paint, but no actual evidence was found on the rest of Samson that he'd ever been painted. However, there was many layers of paint being applied, some of the 18th century schemes had sand mixed with it, to obviously then make the wooden sculpture look more like stone. But the next stage, really, following the paint removal, was to start to consolidate the remaining parts of the figure. it was clear from the start his feet were no longer there due to the length of time he'd been outside, and the fact that the paint was actually probably holding some moisture, which was then eventually running down to his feet. His torso also was extensively damaged by the moisture and the rot. In fact, the core was almost similar to how you'd expect to see some archaeological wood. So following the consolidation, some areas had to be filled with conservation grade material to build the figure back together. So it flowed consistently. Can I actually have the third slide, actually? Sorry, so I just skipped one there. You can see there that this shows, obviously, the first one is with the heavy paint layer on, the second one being the first stages of removing the paint, and you can really start to see the crispness of the carving underneath. Then if we perhaps move on to the last slide, please. And this then shows you more the detail. This is the finished product. I think you can see the mount that we had to construct there to help support the arm, and also to allow it to be freestanding within a showcase. It's now been returned back to Norwich and is on display again for the public there. And I think you'll agree, it's amazing how the oak has withstood 3 centuries of being outside, and the amazing carving initially of the carver in the mid 17th century still remains in pretty good shape, considering its whole history of living outside for all that time. It's a real amazing piece of work that has survived all that time outside, really proving the longevity of oak and the amount of detail you can carve within. That's me finished. I think you'll agree it's outstanding. Now the paint has been removed. It's all really easy to read, and the carving is still so sharp and crisp. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that presentation. I know from the chat boxes that have been popping up on the screen, we're going to return to that. The before and after is really incredible, and the state of it. So thank you so much for that. We'll crack on to our next 2 speakers and come back to everyone in the final questions. We now go on to our antique dealer in the group, who is Richard Coles, director of Godson & Coles. There he is. And Richard has worked in the art and antiques business, he tells us, for over 30 years, and also trained, along with Tom, at Westdean College in Sussex. He went into partnership with Richard Godson. He says their first gallery was in King's Road in London, the famous King's Road, and then they relocated to their current premises at 92 Fulham Road in South Ken. Richard has served on numerous vetting committees, including Grosvenor House, Olympia, and is currently serving on the Masterpiece Fair and the BADA, that is the British Antique Dealers Association Art Fair, on the furniture vetting committees. He is the eye, the design eye, he describes it, behind the pairing of modern art with antique furniture that makes Godson & Coles quite unique. And he works closely with interior designers, as well as private collectors and museums around the world. So over to you, Richard.
Thank you for that, Megan. Hello, everybody. I'd like to talk to you today about the wood in the 18th century cabinet making. I mean, in the 18th century was known as the golden age of cabinet making, and there was, and one of the reasons that is that there was an extraordinary acceleration in global trade, and trade was before it was very localized, but trade was going from literally all around the world, and timbers, they were finding timbers that had never been seen before, and this enabled cabinet makers to really develop their designs in a way that they hadn't been able to. I mean, for instance, mahogany was discovered firstly in Jamaica, and this you could design chairs, for instance, to be much finer. It was great to carve. It was dense. It was quite a dense timber, and they could develop this wonderful, really fine quality of cabinet making and chair making, which before it was just walnut and oak, and all of a sudden, you know, designs could go to places that they never had before. Now, this really sort of illustrates how the global trade in timber resulted in what they could do with marquetry. Now, for instance, I mean, this is a tabletop by Thomas Chippendale Jr. And we're used to seeing furniture, Chippendale's furniture, looking like this, quite muted tones. When this was made in about 1780, it would have been an absolute riot of colour. I mean, if we just look at the different tones at the moment, you've starting from the outside, the outer cross banding is in tulip wood. Tulip wood comes from the East Indies. It's a bright orange wood. You've then got the satin wood from the West Indies, very yellow. Then the lozenges are in purple heart. Well, purple heart is an extraordinary timber. When you cut it, it is quite a boring brown color. But then overnight, it oxidizes and it becomes this vibrant purple. I mean, an alarming purple. So you've got orange, yellow, purple. You've then the harewood, which is bright green, holly of the central fan, white, ebony, black. So this would have been a riot of colors. I mean, it would be quite shocking. And a lot of furniture, a lot of marquetry furniture, it looked very, very different from how we're used to seeing it today. But it complemented the interiors by people like Robert Adam. All the interiors were painted very brightly. The gilding was solid gold. It wasn't muted as we get used to seeing now. But they never had electric lighting, so it was just candle lit and natural light. So they needed the brighter colours. But it was the fact that timber, we're talking about the narrative beauty of timber, and it is the variety of colours, grains, is just amazing. And the cabinet makers must have been, I mean, this must have been like Christmas, all these wonderful timbers arriving. Should we go to the next slide, please? So these timbers were really, really expensive. Trade throughout the world it took a long time to sail to countries. It was dangerous. A lot of ships didn't make it back. This table is veneered in a wood called Amboyner Wood, and Amboyner Wood came from a small island. It was first discovered in a small island in the Moluccas, the Banda Islands, where nutmeg and mace came from. I mean, these were really, really valuable commodities. And when this was first discovered and brought back to England, nothing like this had been seen before. And it was actually more expensive by weight than gold. So these were really, really highly priced. And the furniture makers the quality of the furniture making of this period has never been bettered. But you think that, you know, it has to be sailed back in sailing ships from far ends of the world. I mean, it was quite intrepid. Next slide, please. Well, this looks at first sight to be a standard, you know, a nice standard Regency mahogany sideboard. But when we're looking at furniture, very often you know what wood is what, and you know, you get used to it. But we handled this sideboard a few years ago, and it was quite obvious that I'd never seen this wood before. I couldn't place it at all, and fortunately now we have the ability to analyze timbers. And I was fascinated by this, and it wasn't mahogany. It was a bit like mahogany, but it just wasn't. Anyway, we had it analyzed, and it turned out to be made of stinkwood. And stinkwood is, it comes from a tiny little area in South Africa. I mean, this table was made in around 1820. And so from being what you'd expect a Regency English sideboard, in fact, it was made for the Governor General in South Africa in about 1820 from local timber, stinkwood, and then brought back. So because we were able to find out what wood it was, we could then trace the whole history of it. And in fact, it turns out it's probably the most important piece of stinkwood furniture ever made, and is, I mean, even the legs are solid stinkwood. But you know, it's just fascinating that sometimes you come across something that you just have never seen before, and but we do actually now have the ability to analyze these pieces and get it back into context. So next slide, please. And so, you know, the English, and, you know, obviously the Continentals as well, but the decorative, I mean, the amount of work that went into this furniture was, and they would stop at nothing to discover new timbers from all. This actually is an English timber, interior from an English cabinet, veneered in field maple. So it's an indigenous timber. It was completely veneered it's almost like tortoiseshell. They sanded it. They treated it with something called aquafortis, which is basically nitric acid, and then they rubbed soot into it, and that it gives this extraordinary mottled effect that looks just like tortoiseshell, it's just another example of the wonderful variety of that timber can actually, you know, you see in this whole breadth of cabinet making throughout the 18th century, and the lengths they went to create these glorious pieces that we're still enjoying today. And I think that's probably me done, actually, Megan.
Thank you very, very much. And I know we'll be coming back to some of the timbers, and I have a question I'm going to put to you when we come to Q&A. But before we do that, we have one more speaker. And so we're sort of rounding out our chronology now and moving into contemporary times with Sarah Myerscough. Now, Sarah is director of the Sarah Myerscough Gallery, established in 1998. And the gallery represents a distinguished group of contemporary craft and design artists who specialize in material-led processes with a focus on wood. The gallery works in both public and private collections and has a full program of exhibitions and participates in leading art fairs, including Masterpiece. The gallery aesthetic, Sarah tells us, relishes the connection to the natural world, both organic materials and forms, with a focus on woods. It embraces the elemental and the imperfect, and seeks creative authenticity and integrity, indulging in tactile and sensory experiences which inform each object. And she's going to show us a bit about what she means in the next few images. Sarah.
Hello, thank you, Megan, for that lovely introduction, and hello, everyone across the world. I'm sitting in my Barnes gallery, which I opened a couple of years, but actually it's only been open for 1 year. Obviously, it's been closed for most of this year and past year, so I'm delighted to be here. And I've got a selection of work by contemporary artists that we work with, just so you can see the variety of different materials, different woods, and as Megan mentioned, also now working with more natural materials. So I did start in 1998, but really started specializing in contemporary wood from about 2003, when I realized, I think when Grace and Perry won the Turner Prize, in fact, that contemporary craft and design could be shown in the context of fine art space. So that opened up all sorts of possibilities for interesting dialogue about contemporary art. And I suppose it's, for me, I'm passionate about materials, particularly wood, and the sort of sensory experience of that, and want to really celebrate material and older processes of making in contemporary design. So maybe if I could have my first slide. I've got a few examples, and it's really interesting for me to hear everyone else talk about wood historically and how that chimes so much with contemporary design at the moment, particularly in relation to the topic that we're all discussing, which is the narrative of beauty in wood. And this is no better seen in the work of Ernst Gamper, who's a German artist, wood turner, probably the finest wood turner in the world. And these are beautiful maple pieces. Maple is quite difficult to turn on a lathe, particularly finding large pieces of maple. But these are solid maple branches, which would have been double the size when Ernst found them. I also might add that all of the artists that I work with either work with fallen wood or sustainably produced wood. That's really very much part of their ethos. But these are extraordinary in terms of craftsmanship, because turning on a lathe is incredibly skilled, and when you're working with large lumps of, huge trunks, it's very difficult physical work. And these become very delicate sculptural pieces. Turned when they're fresh, then they start to move as the wood dries, and you get this lovely undulating surface. And beauty here for Ernst is really about imperfection in wood, which is kind of runs contrary to some of the earlier discussions. Next slide, please. These are also turned as well, but it's a very different approach to woodworking. Again, the same kind of amazing technique, and the quality of making is fabulous. These are composite pieces. So each element of these vessel forms are turned in 3 sections to sit together in this vessel form, and then the original burr of the horse chestnut is revealed, as you can see, these wonderful kind of undulating forms. It's revealing the inner beauty of the wood, and they're quite impressive large-scale pieces. And in fact, the V&A just bought one for their permanent collection, which was a real moment of celebration for us, because Eleanor is probably the first woman carving and turning wood to be in their contemporary collection. So that was exciting. But they're monumental, powerful things when you see them, and incredibly sensory and wonderfully tactile. Next slide, please. This is very much in contrast to the other 2 pieces, which are turned. This is a piece by Christopher Kurtz, who's an American artist, working in woodstock, and this is a beautiful carved mobile piece. Interestingly, he was very influenced by Gibbons and has one of the few contemporary artists to actually bring carving back into contemporary design. It's quite eerie, but it's also very compelling. And when you see it, the quality of making is beautiful and meditative. He's a really exciting designer for us to work with. He also makes beautiful functional furniture, which is also very sculptural. And I'm really excited about the overlap between contemporary craft and contemporary design, sitting on that sort of, you know, semi-functional, but also sculptural, and also very much celebrating materials and what they mean today for us. I think that's all my slides. So maybe I'll pass back to Megan.
Thank you very, very much, all four speakers, and not least Sarah. We have some really interesting visuals and ideas, and I think we're going to go back to Laura now, who has been monitoring the Q&A box. So we'll see what questions are coming from the audience. And in the meantime, I would invite also any of the panelists, if they have any questions to address to each other, please do feel free.
Hello, so there were a lot of questions for Tom about the restoration process and whether or not the paint protected the wood underneath, and just asking for a bit more information really about that whole process, if that's possible.
Yes, the paint would have protected the wood beneath. However, it was also trapping water within the sculpture, which caused it to rot as well. So it certainly did help its longevity, living outside for all that time. Yes, and it definitely wouldn't have been in the same condition it was if it hadn't have had a paint layer on it.
And Tom, I may have missed it. Was the paint layer original, do you think? Was that intended by the carver?
Well, as I said, I think we found traces of gilding on the belt buckle and around the trim of his clothing, and I think there's some red paint on the fox as well, but no other part of the figure looked like it had ever had paint on it originally. But yes, certainly doing the analysis, some of the paint layers were definitely 18th century, and they were mixed with sand as well. So they're obviously trying to make it look more like stone at that point. But it's quite amazing that all those paint layers remained on it, and nobody had attempted to remove the layers at any point. So it was certainly a good lot of history there between the paint layers, and all the paint was actually kept, and it's gone back to the museum because it came off in quite sizable chunks. So,
amazing.
No, it was amazing.
And the detail that's revealed, you know, by losing that paint layer, the detail is remarkable when you get back down to the wood.
Yeah, no, it's amazing. Like I say, for something that's been outside all that time, it's I mean, it was an amazing piece of carving in the first place, but to have survived that length of time outside is amazing.
So Laura, I'm looking at the numbers in the Q&A box. Do we have another question?
Yes, there's a question probably for all of the panel individually, but about the changing attitudes towards exposing wood as a material itself compared to covering it up, and whether each of the panelists had something to say about that. So
changing aesthetics, in other words, when do we move from a wooden surface, revealing the wood, to maybe what were perceived as perhaps more glamorous kinds of finishes with painting, with gilding, and so on? Any thoughts on that?
I mean, I can mention something in the context of Green and Gibbons. The first slide I showed you, there was a carving by Gibbons which looked very pale and had that dark background, that was his intention. Whereas in the 19th century, there was that fashion of painting everything very dark. There was So Victorians would have it all like dark brown on a dark brown background, which completely changes the aesthetic of the carving. So that's just an example I could quickly think of.
I think with contemporary design, it's really about revealing the imperfections in wood, and it runs very sort of in contrast from sort of 18th century furniture, was about sort of celebrating the decorative, which is, yes, it comes from a different perception of what beauty really is, and sort of trying to reassess that in contemporary design.
How much do you think of that, that Sarah, springs from a post-industrial or post-machine world, in a sense, whereas the 18th century, we're before it all kicks off with the big bad machines and mass production?
Yes, I mean, that's definitely, I think, in the sort of high-tech world, the sort of craving for the handmade, older processes, something much more immediate, something that has a soulfulness, that brings back that emotional content to artwork that perhaps people desperately are missing at the moment, particularly this year as well. And maybe connecting also with the environment and the world around us, and bringing the outside in. I think that's really our important issues for people.
I think bringing the outside in is a marvelous idea. And I'm thinking of what Richard was showing, you know, the textures of the woods. And you sort of touched upon this, Richard, but I wonder, do you think it is not exclusively, but perhaps a particularly English aesthetic to show things like field maple on an otherwise fairly plainly made cabinet? I mean, it's almost as though the texture, the grain of the wood becomes the decoration. Do you think there's anything in that?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think that cabinet makers explored different qualities of wood, and they must have loved discovering new timbers, and it helped them create designs that had never been seen before. I think, answering the question, I think fashions certainly in the 18th century changed quite a lot, quite rapidly, and you know, there were periods where Japanning was very much in fashion. Obviously, all the wood was covered up. Painted furniture, the wood was covered up. Gilded furniture, but interspersed with that, there was this celebration of the wonderful decorative qualities of wood, which I don't really think has been done better than than they did in the 18th century. It's the designs have never been better. They've been copied, but it must have been an extraordinary period of discovery for them.
Well, thank you for thus far, panel. And I'm looking at, again, the numbers going up in the Q&A box. So Laura, do you have another question for us?
Yes, a question for Sarah. Where would you locate the origins of imperfection in wood design?
Well, I mean, I suppose it's this sort of Japanese tradition, isn't it, of wabi-sabi, and celebrate their natural celebration of imperfection. And I think we now are so trying to so much connect with the world around us, that we notice the imperfections in nature and celebrate those. And I think you can see it in a lot of the artists that we show. For instance, Eleanor Lakeland, where instead of sort of polishing a burr of oak, she sort of literally lifts off the bark with dental tools to reveal all the nodules of that. And a burr originates from when a tree was hurt. You know, it either had a metal intervention, or it had some kind of intervention which created this kind of mass on the side of a tree, and she celebrates that, almost, you know, that hurt, if you like. And I suppose it's really about the hurt in the world around us today. It's kind of reflects that. So I think there's lovely narratives between stories of the maker, what they're trying to say about the world around them, about the material they're working with. And there's also a connection with the place that they found the wood and how important that is to them. And also, of course, the history of the tree itself, and how, you know, celebrating its own story before it either fell or it was cut down. So trees used to be things that we used to celebrate, that we found sacred. And I think that's really what artists are working with, are trying to make us remember, if you like.
Yes, that burr is really extraordinary. It almost looks as though those vessels had been burned or charred, which is what I thought initially looking at them.
Yes.
And then it gradually dawned what you were describing, what was actually going on there.
Yes, so she either scorches the wood, or she'll dye it using the natural tannins. She'll bring out the natural tannins. There's various different processes darkening the wood, but she'll also bleach wood as well.
And Laura, is there...
Yes, well, linked to that actually, Richard, there have been some questions about some of the techniques used in some of the pieces that you highlighted. For example, treating the field maple with nitric acid. And just a question around how those techniques have continued and evolved over time, and if they are still used to the same degree, and if contemporary artists are kind of referring back historically to those techniques.
Interestingly, I don't think I've seen field maple used in furniture making since the early 18th century. I don't think it's a common wood. I know that I think that they also treated some walnut furniture with aquafortis, which gave it a more orangey glow, which would have probably helped bring out the grain in it a bit more. Whether have these techniques been? I think they've been developed. I don't think they've been replicated particularly. I mean, you'd have you know, we've heard how Sarah's artists and craftspeople get their burrs and treat them with different bleaches or tannins to create a different finish. I think that one great point of 18th century furniture, though, is that we love the way that it's mellowed over the centuries. And in fact, if you can get a piece of furniture that has never been touched, it'll have a patina and an atmosphere about it, which is just completely magical. Now, there's no question that these pieces were fabulous when they were made, but they look very different, and they would have been quite harsh and incredibly vibrant, and they've just mellowed down over the years, and we love and appreciate that. But whether the cabinet makers who made them, if they were able to see them now, they'd probably say, God, what has happened to it? You know, finish it, refinish it immediately. But we love, you know, there's nothing we love more than getting a piece of 18th century furniture that has never been touched. And in fact, increasingly, we just won't ever touch it. We'll keep it exactly how it is, because that is very special and rare.
And linked to that, actually, Ada, there are a few questions about Gwyn Gibbon's treatment of wood, and in particular asking about the staircase and whether that was painted or treated in some way to bring out that colour.
All right, so the staircase I've shown is not by Gibbons, it's by Edward Pierce, and it was originally painted, but not in that white color. So the color you saw, that was introduced by John Fowler in, I think, 1970s. But yes, so limewood, so that was limewood, and Gibbons's carving was not really treated, it was plain. That was very different from what was going on in the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, for instance, limewood carving was almost always either gilded or painted. Yeah, and sorry, what was the other part of the question?
about his general treatment of wood and whether he treated the surface of the wood often.
No, so Gibbons not, and that's something very, very unusual, but that became popular in England. But in other countries, that was really not the case. So, as I said, in the Netherlands, I mean, there's also quite a lot of research done on colors and paint, and it's just so bright, and especially ship carving, for instance. It was just so colorful and painted in all different colors. That was, of course, different types of wood was used for that. But I think our idea of this, like, oh, it's all wood, it's all brown, it's just, it's not accurate. It was not what was going on in the 17th century.
Brilliant. And then another question for Tom about how do you foresee the future of these pieces, whether they're historical, contemporary, in terms of conserving wood and looking after wood?
Well, obviously relating to Samson, that there was no way it could have stayed outside any longer than it had been. So it's now certainly been conserved, and it's now within a museum. So it'll be on display forever now, I think, and it will now last forever indoors, with it stored in the correct environment within a showcase. I think there was obviously initially people didn't want to see it removed from its original setting, but I don't think there was any other option really. It had to come in. Oak does fare fairly well outside, but not when it's got to that level of decay. It had to come in.
And Tom, how about the other statue? Because I think there were two, right? There was also
yes, there was two. The other one was actually destroyed, I think, in the 19th century by a fire, and was actually remade again. But it is still in existence. But yeah, not as important as the original mid-17th century Samson. Yeah. So that was Hercules. The other figure was Hercules.
Ah.
Yeah. There were actually fiberglass molds made of it, I believe, at one point as well. So they're still in existence. The building itself, I think, was a nightclub at one point as well. So it was quite it's had quite a checkered history. The building that they were outside.
So Laura, have you got some other questions for us? I'm keeping an eye on both the numbers in the Q&A box and the time.
Yes, perhaps one question for all of the panel to finish on. If you could choose one piece of wooden furniture, work of art in wood that would last for the centuries to come, what would it be?
Shall I start? Silence. I'm thinking of John Makepeace, who makes wonderful English furniture. And we show his Dream collection here at the gallery. It's a beautiful three-legged chair, which is a celebration of both handcrafted material, but also of modern technology, and how each leg is pinned with various metal tiny poles just to give added strength. So it's really marrying contemporary design and using technology as yet another tool in furniture making, but also celebrating traditional craftsmanship, and also the beautiful material, the bur oak, in a very subtle, wonderful way.
So that would go in your Valhalla of wooden objects, the absolute
Yes.
apex.
I would be very happy to live with that for the rest of my life in my home.
I think I have to say those navigation instruments in the Admiralty fireplace, I think, those might be in my Valhalla. Just absolutely astounding carving. And yet you look at them, you think, well, they're obviously wood. You can see the grain is very obvious in the timber, and yet the realism as well. It's a kind of juxtaposition of the organic and the hyper real. So just remarkable carvings.
Absolutely. I mean, I love them very much, and they're exquisite, but also I think they trigger the kind of questions, is it still art? I mean, for me it is, but they're in fact copies of existing navigational instruments. So they're actually identical. So it's almost like Duchamp.
Yes, that's true.
Except it was a real
Not so
toilet
attractive.
seat.
Shall I go? Shall I say? I mean, you know, the whole world of wood is really, really fascinating. Adam Burke wrote a wonderful book on historic cabinet making woods, which is really worth getting. But I love the whole variety. But what is my favorite? I love the I really love the indigenous burrs like bur yew and also the field maple and bur elm. And when these are used in furniture making, they can get, and if they're really untouched, they can get the most fantastic atmosphere to the surface, and they can be really, really special. So you know, you can find we had a very plain bureau bookcase, but it was veneered in this incredible bur yew, and it had never been touched. And it was just, I could have just spent hours looking at this. It was just lovely. Bur yew is a, you know, it doesn't get any better for me. And it's an English one. So there we are.
And Tom,
Yeah,
in your Valhalla of woods, what would you put?
well, I think I'd probably have a Windsor chair with a nice steam bent back in yew, possibly a nice elm seat. But I think for me, the wood is beautiful. The form is beautiful. I love the way they were constructed regionally, the way that the legs were turned, and just the patination that they gain with time. For me, that's beautiful. You know, the patination they pick up with time, and the way the wood they sometimes distort quite a lot. Again, all obviously English timbers, and regionally made. It's you know, you can trace by the turnings on the legs exactly which area they've been constructed in. You know, the turnings would be the craftsman's signature. To me, that is it's beauty.
So what I'm hearing from all of our 4 panelists today is this love of the connection to the organic somehow, and that wood really takes us there. I mean, does carved stone operated quite the same way, or is it just a little bit more abstract, especially with a beautifully polished stone finish? Is it the kind of crunchy, you know, the texture of wood, the imperfections, the irregularities, the grain? Is that kind of what connects us wood lovers together across different periods of time? It's just interesting. I'm hearing the organic qualities of wood sort of coming through, being foregrounded in this discussion.
Yes, I think the beauty of wood, I think it's also about, for contemporary artists, it's about reflecting their sort of personality through material and their love of wood. And I think that really comes across through the making process and the wood they choose.
And isn't it incredible, you know, listening to all of you, the breadth of objects that have been created out of wood. It's quite you know, the artist and craftsman, they've seen a material and they've just exploited it to every angle. I mean, I think it's quite fascinating. I've loved listening to all your different discussions on the way that wood has been used over the centuries, and now I think it's the most extraordinary material.
I agree, and I think wood is a material that makes us feel good, and it's organic, and when you touch it, it's not cold, so there's something very nice about it, like handling it. And I agree that the variety of objects that are created in wood is just incredible, and also depending on type of wood, because of course carvings made of oak are just so different. And when you think about boxwood and some miniature carvings, they're also so intricate. So there's so many different, completely different types of objects, different scale.
Indeed. And I see, unfortunately, the numbers have gone up in the question and answer box. I don't know, Laura, do we have time for one more? We're running perhaps slightly over time.
We are running over a little bit. I think there's time for one more, which has just come in, which is the book on wood that each of the panelists would recommend the most.
Shall I go? It's the book I mentioned, actually, and it is an amazing book. Dr. Adam Bowitt, The Woods on British Furniture Making, 1400 to 1900. Fantastic. It's an absolute tome. The work that went into producing it's fantastic. It's an absolute must if you want to study timber in furniture making. Fantastic book with great illustrations and detailed analysis of everything. It's a really fantastic production.
I would say John Makepeace's Beyond Parnham, which when he set up Parnham College years and years ago, it was a really important art college at that time, and this talks about all the designers that what they've gone on to achieve, which is really interesting. And also just another one is Against the Grain, which really inspired me to move into wood, which is an American exhibition that was put on at the Museum of Design in New York, which brought together artists all working in wood, and that really did show me what was so exciting about contemporary wood design.
And of course, we look forward to the book on Grinling Gibbons later this year. That will definitely go on our list as soon as it's published.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and I also mentioned a book. I actually wanted to say, also mention Adam Bowitt's book, but Richard has already described it. That was also my first choice. But my second choice is a book on Gibbons by David Esterly, who was a scholar and a wood carver. So the way he describes Gibbons's carvings is wonderful, because he has all that experience of carving in wood, but at the same time he's a scholar and he did wonderful research. So I recommend this book to anyone who would like to learn more about Grinling Gibbons.
And Tom, did you have something?
Yes, I do. Going on my talk earlier, read my favourite type of chair, I would perhaps have to recommend the book called The Regional Chair by Dr. Bill Cotton. Is a very good read, and lots of information on all the various different types of regional chairs. And of course, Adam Bowitt's book is also very good, and I would recommend that one as well.
So we have lots of homework for the audience who are listening in. Laura, shall I turn over to you now?
Yes, thank you. And just to say thank you so much for all of the questions that we've had. I think this is the highest number of questions that we've ever had for any of our panels. So thank you very much. And we will aim to answer all of your questions following this by email. I know some of them are addressed to speakers in particular, so I will pass those on and forward you any answers that I receive. So thank you very much to all of our panel for joining us today and for a really fascinating discussion. And thank you to our audience for joining us. And we hope that you will join us for the rest of our programme. We are focusing on pigment in April, so we hope you'll join us for our panel discussions and videos at masterpiecefair.com, and wishing you all a wonderful evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.